Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod. I'm your host, Joe Mosier, and as always, thank you for tuning in today. If you think about the back catalog of this show, if you've been listening for any period of time, over the last 2.5 years, roughly, since we launched the pod, there's been some recurring themes that have shown up time and again, but they get some different names from time to time. We've done episodes where we talked about the problem with falling in love with good ideas, especially your own good ideas. We've talked about the perceived threats of iteration, right? Iteration suggests that an idea or a solution or something you're working on can be improved, which can be a threat to the quality of original thinking. It can be a hard thing to get over and become uncomfortable. We've talked about the danger of falling victim to a data point of one, right? One customer who liked your product, one success case or anecdote that was supportive of the issue, one conference you went to where you had a lot of traffic at your table but no customers. That early suggestion that there's something of value and getting preoccupied with that while ignoring a universe of signals that might tell you otherwise. All of this comes back to a very common and not at all novel notion, and that's the need to solve problems, not sell solutions. We've talked about it since the show started. We talked about it a lot recently, and it's something that I think really, it kind of weaves its way through agribusiness, particularly in times like this, where farm profitability and farm income is down. That ripples out throughout the industry. Everybody's trying to iterate. Everybody's using precious capital to try to improve their operations, improve their offerings, improve their service. Everyone's competing for the same dollar, which is shrinking. And we all sometimes, in the pace of execution, of trying to deliver against our business plans, it's very easy to get distracted and lose sight of what problem we're trying to solve, and then fall into the trap of selling solutions. And so today, I'm excited to feature someone who has not only a lot of experience helping manage teams through this challenge, but who also herself spends a lot of time thinking deeply about the issue. Courtney Yuskis is a commercial leader in ag and sustainability at DTN, a global data and technology services provider to the agriculture, energy, and weather industries. Prior to DTN, Courtney held roles at Yara, at Farm Journal, and the Meredith Corporation. And you're going to hear not just her passion and insights, but some of the specific experiences that she's had, again, helping folks think about that tension of don't overcomplicate things, don't get too obsessed with your own engineering processes and product development and product roadmap. You can do those things, but you can't do them to the detriment of staying rooted in what problem you're trying to solve and for who. This show is all about amplifying voices in ag. It's about aggregating lessons learned in the process, and it's about elevating our collective thinking around strategy execution. And strategy execution is not possible without a robust and clear-eyed understanding of that problem to be solved. And so I think this makes it for a very important conversation. I'm excited to have Courtney on the show today. And with that, here's my discussion with Courtney Yuskis of DTN. Courtney, it is good to see you this afternoon. Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I think I'm really happy to be here.
A reluctant guest, but I am excited for this. And we're going to get into some of the reasons why here in a bit, kind of the unique and different types of positions that you've held in and around agribusiness, I think is going to be very additive to our listeners and a good perspective on some of the recurring themes that we talk about in agribusiness and we talk about specifically on this show. Let's get right into it. You know, one of the things that we've observed, and I don't think this will be a surprise to anybody, is there's this persistent problem in business generally where folks tend to focus too heavily on products. And oftentimes an overweight focus on products usually betrays the fact that there's maybe a failure to understand the underlying problems that you're actually trying to solve, right? It's that products versus problems sort of conundrum. I think it's persistent because we talk about it all the time. Everyone talks about it all the time. From your perspective, Courtney, though, as we think about agribusiness as a specific industry, how is agribusiness doing comparatively to business writ large?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm a farm kid. I grew up on the farm. And as anyone that grew up on the farm or worked on a farm or has experience on a farm knows, you have to improvise a lot. You're running your business. Time is of the essence. There are short windows for a lot of the tasks that need to be done. If something breaks down, if something goes wrong, you have to figure out how to fix it and fix it quickly. And I think sometimes in the ag industry, we lose sight of that timing requirement. We lose sight of the practical application of a product. We lose sight of the actual problem we genuinely need to solve. And I think it's very hard to step back and look holistically at a problem and ask, do we have the right to win here? And I think it's much easier to look at a product roadmap and get everyone internally excited about a roadmap and development and tasks around that product development, which then kind of accelerates this, let's go build a product without doing all of the hard legwork to understand, is this problem going to be applicable where we believe it needs to be?
This idea of just that where we're losing that attention and we're kind of focusing on the product roadmap, hypothesize or speculate for a moment here. Is this good corporate structure and business structure can beat the farm kid out of any farm kid, and we become more sort of process and corporatized, and that's what's causing the loss? Do you think it's folks that don't truly appreciate the timing sensitivity and the urgency of what's happening on the farm, and that's where the daylight starts to emerge? What are your thoughts around how this can happen? Because yes, there's a lot of folks in agribusiness, myself included, that did not grow up on a farm, right? So that's clearly where I'm probably part of the problem. But there's a lot of people who did grow up on farms that, they understand what their grandparents and their parents and their neighbors and their family have gone through. They went through it themselves. And yet this shows up. So thoughts around how this, despite the shared background of many people in our industry, including yourself, despite that, how this still persists and emerges?
Yeah, I don't think you're part of the problem, for the record. And I am also not advocating that everyone that works in this industry should have on-farm experience. I think that would lead to a true lack of innovation and almost this echo chamber of ideas and solutions. So I think we need everyone on board. I think helping folks maybe get a little bit more on-farm experience, a day in the life of a farmer, row crop production, livestock production, any aspect of it really, to just feel how a product might have to be used and in what capacity. And even that, Joe, it's not necessarily required, helpful, not required, because it goes back to what is the problem we're actually trying to solve, understanding, doing the recon of what is it going to take to solve that problem, and then moving, the problem solution spaces. Then you move into product roadmaps and development and iterations. And even then, I think what we sometimes forget is we can build, but then we can iterate and refine continuously.
Yeah. I think there's also something here too around, it's easy to fall in love with what you believe is a great idea, especially if it's your own. And I think while we all would say that we love iteration, I think when you're somewhat infatuated with the value or the novelty or the unique value that this particular idea or solution, how it kind of cuts through the problem, iteration can also feel a little bit threatening because it's changing and it might require you to revisit some of your assumptions. I think about this in the context of our own advisory practice. Some of the things that we did early on, just shy of 5 years ago, some of the things we did very early on, I thought this is what makes the business. This one or two clients needed it. Well, everybody needs it because I really enjoyed doing that work and they got a lot of value out of it. And then suddenly realized that nobody else needed it. And that was a hard thing to say, look, the time you invested in building processes, the times you spent kind of perfecting the different templates and tools that you would use in the facilitation of a particular piece of work, yeah, it has value, but it's maybe not the value that's solving a problem that someone wants to pay you to solve. And so it's kind of also making sure that you're having those periodic points in time where you're going back and saying, looking in the mirror and saying, hey, look, it might be a great idea. That might not mean we're going to do it. Something you said early on, though, too, you said, do we have the right to win? Well, say more about that.
Yeah, I would love to say that I am not guilty of ever falling in love with my own idea or product development concept. That would be a lie. And I think I've learned over the years that exactly as you said, it might be a great idea for one customer, maybe two customers, but then this right to win concept comes into play. Do we have the right to win in a particular space at scale, right? Do we have the resources needed? Do we understand the value creation? And if a farmer can implement this and still be profitable? And if not, what needs to change? And agree also that iteration can be scary because sometimes it means you are wrong. But I think that's healthy to recognize that and to be able to pivot and to understand what could be done to either improve the right to win, to improve farmer profitability, to improve efficacy of the product overall and usability. Like we should constantly have that in the back of our heads. Like this is a great idea, sure, but is it working? If it's not, how do we fix it? And if we can't, let's move on.
So it's almost like pressure testing the idea from every angle. Do we have the right to win? We've got a great solution to a problem nobody cares about. We don't have the right to win. We've got a problem that everyone wants to have solved. We've got the solution that could do it. We either lack the capital, the human capital, the financial capital, or the execution capacity to build it and deploy it. Therefore, we don't have the right to win. Or frankly, it's a big problem. We've stacked the deck with talent. We've got a full bank account, and yet we can't figure out what to do to actually fix the problem. We also don't have a right to win. So that's kind of looking at it from every angle and sort of saying, do we even deserve to be here? Should we be competing here?
Exactly. I like this game that we're playing where I say something not so eloquent and then you articulate it much better.
All right, it's just me thinking out loud. So So back to the original question here. To the extent that you have an opinion on this, I think it's very easy for us to fall into a habit of navel gazing and either saying agribusiness is great at this or we're bad at this, et cetera. Now, I do think that this problem we're talking about does exist at scale outside of agribusiness. But from your perspective, are we the norm? Do you think we struggle the same as any other industry, or do you think we are faring worse because of the unique timing pressures that are the customers, the farmers that we serve are under? Or how would you grade us on a relative basis?
Really good question. And I'll be completely transparent. The vast majority of my career has been spent in agriculture. And so I don't want to get out over my skis here, but I look at my sister who's had a very successful career in healthcare, and healthcare has faced many of the same challenges, right? Data standardization, interoperability, being able to connect the dots, being able to look at successful collaborations at scale and what can be done if, the baseline or the foundation is fixed. I think there are a lot of parallels in that we can draw from. And if I'm just looking at healthcare, I would say ag is not any different in terms of where we are today. It's challenging. Anyone that's interacted with me has probably seen my favorite meme ever, where it's a couple of stick figures saying, oh no, there are 14 standards. We need one common standard. And then you flip to the next slide and it's the same stick figures. Current situation, we now have 15 competing standards. And I think that just happens time and time and time again. So when I'm talking about like fixing the core problem or understanding if we have the right to win, it really does. You have to look holistically at the current industry at large and figure out, okay, can we work within the confines of this? If not, what needs to change at the foundational level? And do we have the right to make that fix or not? And in a lot of cases, you don't, or it's going to take a lot more collaboration than what might be possible today.
For sure. And I think, and again, I've spent the majority of my career in ag as well now. I won't say that the stakes are as high as somebody who is, suffering a emergency health situation. But if we step back from and don't over dramatize this, if you think about the average producer, right, they get 40 shots on goal a year. They get 40 paychecks, not a year, a career, 40 checks a year, career, sorry. And when you look at it through that lens, the stakes are incredibly high for that producer, for a particular solution to not just work as as expected, but then to also deliver the benefits that are promised. Benefits as promised, net of the investment and the disruption required to adopt it and implement it. And so when you think about that, when you kind of really think through the eyes of the producer and say, look, they're not being stubborn or resistant to change by default. They're operating at thin margins, high stakes, and you think about the problem, the interoperability, the value proposition within that context, that should be a good anchoring mechanism to hopefully keep some of this solution preoccupation at bay. But if nothing else, I think teams just need to keep talking about it. That's probably one of the best things you can do to keep it front of mind.
Yes. The one thing I would add to that is also the timeline in which that investment is going to be returned.
Yes.
It's probably unrealistic to think that in a lot of cases, especially in ag tech, that you're going to see ROI in a year. So I think we have to understand what is realistic. Is it 2 years? Is it 3 years? If it's 3 years or more, are there warranty programs in place? What exists to help that farmer move to a practice change or move to some sort of production change that's going to be required to ensure that investment? And then what does that look like in perpetuity? Are there diminishing returns after year 5, year 6? Really just thinking through that. And as you said, having open, transparent conversations. I think those kinds of conversations are what's going to move this industry forward.
Yeah, an idea that I had, and perhaps this is being done, I'm not aware of it, and perhaps it's so reckless that it'll never be considered. And
Ooh, I like reckless.
But you think about the risk that you're asking a producer to take, whether you're selling them seed genetics, new types of in-the-field operating equipment, some type of software to monitor their planting intentions and their yield performance and where they would merchandise and market their grain, whatever it might be. What would it look like if you actually had an indemnification clause whereby, so you said, yeah, this is a solution that may not deliver a net benefit return until year 3, right? That's where you can start to see a meaningful change in your yield performance, in the condition of the crop coming out of the field, the value of the information to drive better decisions, whatever that is. And in the meantime, we keep you whole. We cannot be contributing to a backslide in your business. The challenge, of course, being farming is a multivariable challenge, right? And you could look at, weather conditions, there's what the market is providing, there's what your competitors and neighbors are doing, there's energy prices. And so it's very hard for any solution provider to come in and basically take all that risk onto their balance sheet and de-risk the producer's investment in this. But I do think in some ways, if you could think about indemnification to keep the producer whole in one aspect of their business relative to the risk that they're taking on by trying your product, I mean, that's sort of the ultimate signal of conviction in what you have to offer. In the consulting space, it's value-based pricing.
Exactly.
You don't charge, and then you get a taste of the value that's created. And if no value is created, well, you've just worked for free. So it's an alignment of incentives. Again, I don't know, perhaps it is reckless or just crazy, but something that does come to mind at times, particularly when we're asking farmers to take outsized risk in exchange for a really flashy website and a great YouTube video.
Right. And as you mentioned, we already know that this is a thin margin, high risk business to begin with. And so we're asking for a producer to implement an additional level of risk. And if there's no skin in the game, from the company's perspective, then it is like it's difficult. And you're also making me reconsider my answer earlier about if ag, if what we're doing in the space is the norm or if it's, maybe we're behind or ahead. And I think one of the areas where we might lose sight of the fact that farms are businesses. The producers are the CEO of these businesses, and they have to run a profitable business. And if we approach every product development, every solution sale with that in mind, I think it gets us closer to this indemnification idea. At my company, we're not going to invest in something or purchase something or go into a collaboration agreement unless there is high chances of return. That's just good business. And why can't we take that same application at the producer level?
Absolutely. Well, you kind of teased out there, you said in my business. Let's take a detour here for a moment, Courtney. As you said, your career's been largely in agriculture. You grew up on a farm. You've had a variety of interesting roles within agriculture, including, leading commercial operations, digital ops, helping to build enterprise solutions, digital innovation. Maybe give us a little primer on your background and what that journey thus far. You've got a lot of fuel in the tank and years left to give, but what this has revealed thus far to you about ag's maturity and actually being able to develop and also market effective solutions.
Yeah, well, I did grow up on a farm. I never thought that my career would be in agriculture. I actually thought and wanted it to be in human resources until I experienced human resources for roughly 6 months post-college and realized I am perhaps not built for this. And then I spent a couple of years overseas in the Peace Corps and randomly was assigned to the Ministry of Agriculture, which was enlightening, humbling, a lot of other words, but the more years that pass, the more fond my memories of that experience are. And then when I came back to the States, I was in the nonprofit world for a couple of years and ended up back in agriculture. So I remember Drake and Company and the Country Living Association and the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association. And the people in this industry are really incredible to work with. And I think there is a true sense of collaboration and of everyone wanting to move forward. But I kind of morphed from that nonprofit into more advertising, media sales. And then that led me down a path of more digital productization. How do we take the data that we have and create real intelligence from it and start to productize that? But I think all of those experiences in working with so many people in the industry over the years has just, helped me understand that when it comes to solution development, sometimes we over-engineer what actually needs to be done. We want to think big picture. There are brilliant minds in this industry working on huge problems, and that's awesome, and we need that. But I think we also need people that can say, great, we need to get here in 10 years, but what are the iterative steps we need to take in the next 3 months, in the next 2 years, in the next 4 years? What does success look like? And then start to map out, what are the risks? What are the gaps? How are we going to solve for those? And this comes back to, do we have the right to win? Can we actually do this? And again, if not, why not? Back to your indemnification idea. I think I posed a question, and it was a genuine question, like, why can't we do this? What is stopping us from doing this? What is the first step we would need to take to make that happen? And just approach every problem that way. Again, I'm not necessarily like a long-term strategic thinker. I have more of an operational mind. I think in boxes and arrows, and I think about iterative next steps. And I think it takes all of these different approaches to really move the needle in this industry.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
Something kind of crystallized for me just now. So much of this is innovation, product development, product roadmaps, iteration, all those things, those processes that happen within the four walls of a business. We do those in a generally rigorous and structured way as a means for ensuring company profitability, right? They're not meant to completely unrisk an investment, but they're meant to de-risk it and bring the risk down to a manageable level, while still likely to produce a profitable outcome or provide the off-ramps along the way, whereby you say, you know what, we've learned enough to know that we don't have the right to win, and so we're going to go a different direction. And in some ways, those processes, which are so rigorous, become divorced from farmer profitability unintentionally. And I know we're beating the drum here and kind of going back to where we started, Courtney, but if you were to think about all the different steps in the development of a solution, the investments required, the de-risking exercises required along the way, the roadmap that it builds, the off-ramps that are required, if you thought about those, not just in terms of how does this drive company profitability, but you had it mirrored in parallel with farmer profitability, I wonder how much that would actually keep that in the conversation. Because this is a bit anecdotal, I don't have empirical data to support this, but the number of times I've seen companies really require the product management team and the internal advocates to really sell from all angles why this is going to be the right thing for the company, and then turn around and ask the farmer, we're going to have to iterate and figure this out as we go. It's like, well, you didn't have to figure out as you were going when you were funding the development of the technology. You had all your questions answered. Perhaps we owe the producer the same benefit along the way, and actually rooting it in not just company profitability, but farmer profitability as well. But I digress. I think our listeners get enough of me thinking out loud. You spend a lot of time in ag media and building different digital solutions and enterprise solutions to support that space. And then earlier this year, you joined DTN. Can you maybe take a couple of minutes to tell us who DTN is, what your role is there, and most importantly, how you spend your time these days?
Yeah, I think it's constantly evolving. I have known of DTN for most of my career, especially when I was in the media space. I think I am impressed with the depth of kind of decision grade data that DTN has. We operate in the energy space, in the weather space, and then in the ag space. I am focused in the ag space and primarily in sustainability. And a lot of my days are spent doing what we're talking about today. What are the actual problems, and does DTN have a right to solve for them? And then I spend time in compliance and tax credits with the low carbon fuel standard, with 45Z. I will not say that DTN has the end-to-end solution, but I think we are getting much more clarity on where we can bring value in those particular programs and what the partners look like in order to bring an end-to-end solution together. Because again, if you think about our customers or the producers, the easier we can make a solution, not just to purchase, but to implement, that we can demonstrate value creation, and we do take a value-based selling approach, then I think the easier things become. And because this requires considerable collaboration, regardless of whether we're talking about Farmers for Soil Health or something like 45Z, we have to be completely transparent, and we have to be willing to say with confidence, here's what we can do, here's what we cannot do, and here are the partners we're going to bring in to solve for those gaps.
Interesting. So in this idea of the value-based approach to providing solutions, we said earlier, that's really risk on, right? That's taking on a lot of the risk and being very confident in the unique skill sets and resources and intelligence and insights that you have, and conviction to execute. Something I know you and I talked about earlier this year when we first met is around the value of skepticism. And I kind of want to loop this in here a bit, and bear with me here as I frame up my question. Again, we talked about this idea of de-risking earlier on, and I think it's easy to mistake de-risking for mitigating or removing risk from a strategy, but sometimes de-risking also involves just simply understanding the potential downside of a set of actions or what could go wrong in a particular solution. So if DTN is getting ready to propose a series of steps and solutions to a client, you have to kind of consider, especially in the context of value-based pricing, where it's going to be high risk, high reward, what can go wrong. And so that idea of understanding what can go wrong is really important. Now, asking the question, though, what's going to blow this up? What's going to cause this to go sideways? That can literally feel like a wet blanket, really, when it's just a healthy dose of skepticism, right? So in my mind, it's really important to strategy development and execution, but it kind of runs head on into the internal sort of energy and optimism and excitement and enthusiasm for an idea. My question to you then, with all that being said, is in the context of the work you're doing at DTN and more generally in the work that you've done in ag, how do you look at applying skepticism internally? And how do you do it in a way that doesn't disengage or artificially slow down innovation, or frankly just make you the person nobody wants to ask for an opinion because they know you're going to Chicken Little it and bum everybody out.
Well, I think I have been that person, and folks that are listening that have worked with me might be saying, yep, check that box. But, there's a couple different avenues here. I do appreciate a healthy dose of skepticism, and I think it is important for us to be able to embrace that, but in a way that is not so abrasive that it turns everyone off and really derails maybe what was a productive conversation. And so I tend to ask a lot of questions based on past experiences. I've seen something like this in the past. Here's what didn't work. But then you have to force yourself to also say, here's what I think would have made it better. I think that exercise of, yes, this went wrong, or yes, there's a problem here, but here's a proposed solution. And then invite people to think about what that proposed solution should be, could be. Sometimes the answer is, we're not going to solve it. But in many cases, there's a really innovative approach that is born, again, from mistakes made, lessons learned. Like, let's accelerate the solution now because we have kind of understood the risks and we understand what has gone wrong in the past. But more importantly, how we prevent that from happening again. How do we leapfrog ahead because of what we already know? And I think asking people to draw on those experiences and not to be afraid to share their experiences. But again, the critical part is don't just share the problems, share what would have prevented that problem or fixed that problem or help us overcome that problem. In my mind, that's how you start to bring a little more skepticism in, but in a more positive way. I will attribute this next phrase to my former manager over at Yara. He always made us ask, don't tell me everything that could go wrong. Tell me what has to be true for this to be right. And then let's back into the steps that it would take for us to get there.
No, I love that. And that's sort of when the skepticism shifts from being abrasive or meant to slow things down versus being healthy. Is, yes, here's where I've seen something very similar in intention go sideways in the past. This is a thing that happened. We have to understand and appreciate that this has happened in the past. And then that second question, here's what I believe would have helped it be successful. Now, what can we do with that? Sometimes when you look at these, you look at product launches, you look at new business launches, new service lines, et cetera, and there's this element of, some people call it the jobs to be done framework, thinking about your clients. Sometimes it's scenario planning, looking for edge cases and how it's going to be used or how it could break. This is just scenario planning with examples that are anchored in experience. So you don't even need to go through the work of, I've been on projects before where somebody brings up a really interesting edge case that absolutely exposes weakness in a particular solution that's being proposed, to which someone can say, that's never happened before. All these things would have to happen in a certain way for that particular event or that set of conditions to present themselves to us. And then that loses credibility and doesn't get any attention. Maybe it should have, maybe it shouldn't have. But when you're going from your experience to say, oh, what would happen if this occurred? Because P.S., it has occurred. And I can timestamp it. I can tell you who was there and what happened. That feels like a very pragmatic and, reality anchored approach to achieving healthy skepticism.
Yeah, I think, you can start to bucket things. Known knowns, known unknowns, things that we're going to have to mitigate. In the unknown unknowns, weather is oftentimes an unknown unknown. Okay, what happens if we take weather out? What else could we solve here given the known knowns and the known unknowns? And what does that look like? And again, anchor it, just as you said, in our past experiences and leverage that to not repeat those same mistakes.
Yep. And I don't want to be too cavalier here when we're talking about high investment, high capital intensive investments and high stakes solutions being promoted to producers. But sometimes if a team gets stuck in this activity of what could go wrong, because immediately you're starting to, you're buffering and you're thinking about what's likely to go wrong, which is just ripe with all of your cognitive biases and the things that you've already thought about before. And if you've thought about it before, you've probably engineered it out, or you have a relatively intelligent answer to it. Sometimes we've worked and said, okay, look, guys, what's the worst thing that could happen here? I think about that when we started this business. What's the worst thing that could happen? No clients for a long period of time, and you sort of like, you go from that, most negative outcomes will work back. And when you sometimes say, okay, here's the worst possible scenario at product launch, here's what that would look like. And then what would we do in response? If you can get your head around what you would do in response to the worst possible set of outcomes, chances are everything in between, you'd also be able to manage. Now, that assumes that the worst possible outcome, you say, yes, we have a set of actions we could take that we feel comfortable with. Now, you might just say, well, that would be horrific and a bloodbath, and we can't possibly imagine it, in which case, okay, let's stay there for a few minutes. But if you say, well, we would do X, Y, Z, okay, you're probably on the route to de-risking in a pretty productive way.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And again, it's that fine balance of negativity and positivity and continuing to help people understand what could be possible, but balancing that with, okay, let's play it out. What is the absolute worst that could happen? And sometimes you find maybe it's not as bad as you were actually thinking when you get down to the brass tacks of it. And I think that also encourages people to rethink. I think this also ties back to our build and iterate and how iteration can be scary. But for me personally, I always want someone that's going to potentially raise a red flag at any point, whether it's, in beta, whether it's in production. You want people saying, I don't think this is working correctly, or I see something here. And you want to be able to foster that kind of environment that encourages that so you can more proactively solve for those. The last thing you want is a customer coming to you, pointing out that there's a flaw or, some sort of error. You want your teams to be finding those and proactively solving for them. And that's an active internal collaboration exercise. And back to building on our own experiences, there are so many different roles involved in product development. And I think encouraging and being willing to hear the different perspectives, whether it's, product management or engineering or, the sales side, everyone should be coming together to share their perspectives, their lessons learned, how they would prevent those same mistakes from happening, because that's the type of collaboration that's needed for robust development of not just products, but like real solutions that are solving problems. And that ties back to the producer or to the customer as well, right? They also need to be engaged in those conversations.
Absolutely. Yes, the question I had is something you said there, sometimes when you conceive of the worst possible outcome and you realize it's actually not that bad.
Now, some could be very bad.
So you said sometimes, or oftentimes, I think you said that, they aren't quite as bad as you maybe had feared kind of in the abstract. But when you've looked at that and in those projects where you've been a part of a team where they said, you know what, actually the negative case, the bear case isn't as bad as we feared, was that driven more by the likelihood of occurring was lower than they had expected, or the materiality of the downside impact was lower than perhaps feared? Was it a likelihood or a materiality issue?
I would say more materiality.
So still very likely to occur, or equally likely to occur.
But it's just not going to hurt as badly as we thought it might. It's the materiality of it. But part of it is because when you put it on the table, you realize that you could solve for it. It's materially not as negative, or the impact is not as bad because there are plenty of ways to mitigate. Or perhaps you start to understand, oh my gosh, this solution isn't right here, but it's the gap we've been needing over here. So we're actually, all the work we've done could potentially solve another problem that we've been spinning out on.
Sure. Just a lift and shift to another problem within the business. Yeah.
Yes.
And when you've looked at these things where actually there have been some material risks to the solutions, and this is kind of in the digital product space, of course, where you've been working, but where have you seen these cluster? Have they been risks to customer adoption? Have they been more in the installment phase, the reliability of the solution, customer service for when things aren't working properly? Have you seen any sort of clustering of where teams tend to experience the most friction, or is it equally distributed across the entire spectrum from development to launch to support?
I would say it's rarely equal distribution. I think that we sometimes make assumptions around the usability of a particular solution, not just a user experience, but also how it integrates with their existing ecosystem and how it fits in and what kind of timeline it's going to take, how much hands-on training and support is going to be needed to ensure adoption. Because we could think that we're building, and I've seen this across my entire career, we have built the easiest to use, simplest solution, but you plug it into someone else's ecosystem and the adoption isn't there, not because it's not the right solution, but because we haven't invested the right resources to ensure that adoption, to be there to walk through the implementation, to be there to ensure that they are leveraging it at its highest capacity.
Well, we've seen things too where solution providers have actually gotten a coveted space in the workflow, which is kind of where you want to be from a digital solution perspective. So you're in the workflow, but in order to do the set of activities that the solution requires in order to deliver that value, it actually occurs outside of the workflow or in a separate login screen or separate browser, et cetera, in which case it becomes somewhat disruptive. It becomes an extra point of friction, and it is absolutely as easy as shown on demo day and in user acceptance training. But of course, in real life, the UAT, user acceptance, is going to be much broader than just what are they clicking within your solution to get the value that you promised.
Correct. I'm thinking about, let's say, precision technology in ag, and there are amazing products, and in and of itself, that product could be incredible. But when you plug it in to what the producer or the customer is doing day to day and realize like it's an extra step, there is no time to take that extra step, or the value is not high enough, right? That's that goes back to solving the initial problem and understanding what that is, not just like, yeah, we solved this problem, but we solved this problem in the ecosystem and infrastructure in which it needs to be solved. That's how you get adoption. That's how you get the stickiness. And that's how you win business long term.
Absolutely. Well, one last question that's been on my mind here, Courtney, and I suspect you have a point of view on this, but we'll see which direction it goes. I mean, we've talked a lot about things today that require humans to make decisions, to collect data, look at information in a workflow, look at a problem to be solved, look at the materiality of that problem, understand risk, et cetera. So there's a lot of human interaction, but there's a lot of underlying objective data, ones and zeros, that are being used to build solutions, to make decisions, to improve adoption, et cetera. Given where we're at in this moment, it's Q4 of 2025. AI is still headline news. LLMs are still something that everyone's talking about. Everyone's playing with, and if you want to get funded right now, you put AI in your URL, and that tends to be an accelerant for getting your next up round. But have you seen indications of where AI and LLMs and the different solutions that are out there are going to be additive and improving some of the things we've talked about today? Or is it too early to tell? Or have you actually seen the bear case where you actually causes you some concern in how AI might be used in the product development, product testing, product launch, and support lifecycle?
I think I have a good use case for where there's a positive application. And then I think I will share some concerns in this space as well. I'll start with the concerns because, as we know with data, garbage in is garbage out. I was just at a conference where there was a major equipment manufacturer on a panel, and they were talking about, the field level data collection that they can offer, and they have opened up access to that. But I've driven the combine, I've driven the planter. I know that I have forgotten to put the right field or the right hybrid or, change fields. I know that the calibration isn't always accurate. And so if we want to solve this interoperability issue, and if we want to understand how we can leverage AI to reduce the burden of farmer data entry, right, across the board for multiple use cases, I think we have to really take a hard look at the integrity of that data that's flowing into these models and into these systems and understand how we can better solve that. I'm going to pivot now to perhaps a more positive use case. Again, I'm going to go back to our Farmers for Soil Health program. And we have learned in this program, just as in every farmer-facing program, that The burden of data entry is incredibly high. The farmers will need support to do that. They may be pulling something from a PDF, right? And we're asking them to translate that into a field boundary. They might be pulling something from an Excel file, and we can try to write a script and automate that. It is imperfect. But where we've reduced the lift of the data entry is in remote sensing, particularly for cover crops and for tillage practices. It's not perfect. I'm not saying we're 100%. I'm not saying our data science team at DTN is even, 90%. But when we can get to 70, 75% accuracy on that remote sensing, right? Think about all the ground truthing that we have alleviated from the whole supply chain needing to get that kind of data. And that is something where we can continue to feed the models with imagery, with additional ground truth data, iterate and improve on. So to me, that's a really positive, applicable experience that I have had at DTN with AI and with modeling.
Well, I think that's an interesting example too, because it's, yes, perhaps you're introducing a couple of bespoke and unique technology solutions into a farmer's operations. You got the remote sensing systems, and then you have the subsequent data scraping, data coding, data, filling the database, et cetera, the LLM or the bot on the backside doing that. It may be two separately developed and deployed solutions, but they become then one is an extension of the other. It's an extension of the automation with not a lot of interruption in between. And then requires, simply the human is obligated then to be doing some spot checks for accuracy and looking for obvious anomalies or, whatever else might be. But I think that's also very interesting when you think about the context of AI, which kind of right now has become synonymous with LLMs, which I think it's myopic and incorrect, but that's sort of how the public writ large is looking at AI. When the LLM becomes an extension of automation, of machine learning or machine automation elsewhere in the operation, that's, I think, a real multiplier for the value. And also, like you said, it greatly reduces the lift and demands on the customer to do these rote tasks that are incredibly important, but not necessarily all that additive in terms of using your time as a CEO of your farm to be doing that work.
Yeah, I would like to add one more comment here, and it's around agentic AI. And I think there are vast opportunities to, we had talked about the user experience and how every person or every customer even wants a different experience or expects a different experience. And I think it's very hard to build for that. So how do we leverage agentic AI to make it more of a natural language prompt, to get the information that they're asking for, to garner the intelligence that they need to see out of a particular data set?
Any ideas on how close or far away we are from something like that being ready at a retail level at scale?
A few weeks ago, I had the chance to attend a intimate summit, and this is what really opened my eyes to how we could leverage agentic AI. Instead of building these disparate dashboards or these kind of one-off user experiences, they are building out the natural language prompts to facilitate an ease of use and facilitate more adoption and the ability to actually leverage all the data that might already exist today.
Interesting. Okay. So the future is here.
I feel like it is.
Well, that's, I think, a good place for us to leave it today. We covered a lot of ground from the products versus solutions, the tension and iteration, the value of skepticism, all these different things. And Courtney, I just wanted to say thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us on the Pacesetter Pod.
Well, it has been absolutely my pleasure, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this.
It was a joy having you on. I look forward to staying in touch and keeping abreast of what you have going on in your new role. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into today's episode. I hope that you found something not just of interest, but of actionable value in our conversation today. And if you did, please consider sharing this episode with someone that you think would find similar benefit. It's the very best way you can support the show and the best way you can help us in our mission of elevating thinking around strategy execution across the ag supply chain. I look forward to having you join us again right here on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is the podcastfactory.com.